Welcome to Chapter 39, Hazardous Materials, Mass Casualty Incidents, and Incident Management. So let's talk about some hazardous materials. So a hazardous material is any substance or material in the form which poses an unreasonable risk to health, safety, and property when transported in commerce. So there's about 5 different levels of training. First responder awareness, operations, and then you have hazmat techs and specialists, and then on-site scene commanders. So our responsibility is really just to recognize that it's a hazmat incident and start the proper people. Typically, our job is not to do anything with the hazmat deal unless you are trained to do so and in working in that capacity. So incidents involving common carriers, trucking terminals, chemical plants, places where chemicals are used, delivery trucks, ag and garden centers, railways, laboratories, all of these can be a hazmat incident. Okay, so all patients leaving the site should be considered contaminated until proven otherwise as well. We want to control the scene. So what's going to happen is we're going to establish this danger zone. You're going to have a hot zone, a warm zone, and a cold zone. The hot zone is the area of contamination or danger. The warm zone is that decontamination corridor. And then the safe zone or cold zone is where equipment and rescuers are staged. You want to identify the substance, at least make an attempt to assess the material and the severity. All trucks, all public safety vehicles are required to have a orange book, a ERG guide. So you just want to make sure that you have one. So ways to obtain the information safely. We're going to use binoculars to identify signs, labels, or placards from a safe distance. We're going to search for placards, look for labels, and invoices, bills of lading, shipping manifests for various things to kind of identify what may be in that vehicle. Review safety data sheets, interview workers leaving the hot zone, and then get expert advice. There's a couple different apps that you can get, but the ERG is probably the biggest one. And then Chemtrek is a resource that you can actually call to find out about the hazardous material. Chemtel is another company that does that. And then there's a current list of state and federal radiation authorities, regional poison control centers, and be sure to leave thorough information about the scene, callback, container conditions, location, quantity, and injuries and exposures. Rehab operations. This is located in the cold zone. It is protected from weather, large enough to accommodate multiple rescue crews. It's easily accessible to EMS units, and it's free from any kind of exhaust fumes, and allows for rapid re-entry into the emergency operation. So when we care for these contaminated patients, they're going to be decontaminated in the warm zone, and then you're going to treat in the cold zone. Field decontaminated patients are not completely clean. So just remember that even though they were field decontaminated, they still need to go through decontamination processes further on down the road. Some of these teams, these hazmat teams, have different people on their teams. They have paramedics, they have EMTs. I think most of them are at least an EMT. So if they go through a decon process and they start to treat the patient in the hot zone. They go through this whole decon process, and as they get deconned, they start to switch out equipment. So if the patient was intubated or has an airway or is being bagged, all of that equipment is contaminated, so it can't come with the patient. And it really doesn't get decontaminated. It just gets switched out. Protecting your vehicles from contamination. Consider used equipment as disposable. And any kind of structural firefighting clothing is not designed or recommended for hazmat environments. So there's 4 types of patients. There's the uninjured, not contaminated, injured, not contaminated, and uninjured, contaminated, and uninjured, contaminated. So you're either contaminated or not contaminated, and you're either uninjured or injured. Okay, so take precautions appropriate to the substance as listed in the ERG. Follow first aid measures listed in the ERG, and manage the patient's critical needs. So ABCs. Okay. If treatment calls for irrigation with water, remember that water only dilutes most substances, but it doesn't neutralize them. And after treating the patient, we're going to decontaminate ourselves, and clothing may need to be disposed of. So there's a couple different phases of decon. So there's gross decontamination, which is just the removal or chemical alteration of the majority of the contaminant. And then there's secondary decon, which is residual product contamination, and it's a little bit more thorough. So there's a couple different ways we can decon patients. You can use emulsification. You can do a chemical reaction to neutralize it. You can disinfect. You can dilute it. You could do absorption or adsorption, and then you can also remove it and dispose of it. So in decon procedures, our objectives are to determine the appropriate level of PPE based on the materials and associated hazards, properly wear and operate in PPE, establish an operating time log, set up and operate the decon line, and prioritize the decon of patients according to a triage system. Perform triage in the PPE and be able to communicate while in PPE. So basic list of equipment is buckets, brushes, solutions, tubs. You can have a shower. I mean, there's lots. Okay. You need a dedicated water supply, tarps or plastic sheeting, contaminant vessel for water runoff, pump to transfer the wastewater from the decon tubs to a contaminant vessel, an A-frame ladder, appropriate level PPE for responders as well. Okay. Decon for patients wearing PPE. So we're going to rinse at the head, start and work down. Scrub the suit with the brush, starting at the head and working down. Rinse again at the head, working down, and assist the responder in removing that PPE, and then also contain any kind of runoff. The first consideration is for patients not wearing PPE is responder safety. Use the public address system to direct ambulatory patients to the decon line. Patients remove their clothes and contact lenses, double bag clothing, remove receive a 2 to 5 minute water rinse starting at the head, and then provide patient cover for modesty. All right, so here is a video of a decon process.
So in this case, it's 5 minutes. All right. All right, go ahead and turn the water on. Okay. So that's a 1 minute timer on this. 1 minute is up. All right, 1 minute's up, so go ahead and shut the water off. All right. Open the door.
All right, so that was just kind of a overview of the decon process and how it works. All right, so let's talk about mass casualty incidents. This is a video from the Boston bombing, and just kind of a quick deal here.
We were able to reconstruct it all moment by terrifying moment. The attack appears timed for maximum impact. Just before 2:50 p.m., this is the viewpoint seen by many of the 26,000 marathon runners who are approaching the finish line. The first of the two explosions rocks the sidewalk along the course. White smoke blasting into the air, blowing metal barricades into the street, spewing shrapnel into crowds gathered at the finish. Captured from multiple angles just as the race clock approaches the 4-hour and 10-minute mark. Marathon runner Bill Ifrit is knocked to the ground. 12 seconds later, as many flee the scene, a second explosion goes off about 130 yards from the first, less than a block away.
Get out of the stands.
Very loud. The ground shook. You could just feel it going down through you.
As the injured lay on the pavement, blood staining the ground, emergency medical technicians, Boston police, and some 400 National Guardsmen already on hand for the race immediately triaged the wounded. The event's medical tent was transformed into a trauma unit.
I saw one guy with his legs gone at the knees, some ankles and feet missing, shrapnel wounds on people on the sides of the head.
By 3 p.m., just as the president is being briefed on the attacks, reports trickle in of yet another explosion, this time at Boston's JFK Library. It's later deemed unrelated, but in the growing confusion, there are reports of additional devices, and several schools and hospitals are briefly evacuated. Meanwhile, over 130 victims are being transported to 6 area hospitals, and just after 6 p.m., President Obama addresses the country, vowing to find those responsible.
Make no mistake, we will get to the bottom of this. Any responsible individuals, any responsible groups will feel the full weight of justice.
Stand by. No matter how many times you see it, we were able
So with mass casualty incidents, they're few and far between, but they do happen. And when they do happen, we have to have a plan. That plan is typically put in place long before the incident actually happens. If you go to the CDC website, you can find their plan for a zombie apocalypse. So, they have a plan for just about everything. So you want to know your local disaster plan. It's written to address events conceivable for a particular location. It is well publicized and realistic, and it's also rehearsed. The incident command system, so NIMS, I'm not going to get a whole lot into this. You should be taking the NIMS 100, 200, 700, and 800. And all of that will go into this. But there is, basically there's command operations. So in command you have operations, planning, logistics, and finance. It can be for a single incident or a unified, or it can be a unified command. If you're going to have a unified command, that means that you're going to have one command post with PD, fire, EMS, any other player that may have an interest in it. For short-term incidents, you're not necessarily going to get into logistics and finance. You may get a little bit into planning, just planning ahead for that incident, but it may occur. If you get into planning and logistics, or logistics and finance, you're looking at opening the Emergency Operations Center and having that EOC as a resource. Command functions. So the incident command is assumed by the senior member of the first service on scene. Options once reinforcements arrive is to either continue to be in command or transfer command to someone of a higher rank. Scene size up. So arrive at the scene and establish incident command. Do a walk through the scene to assess number of patients, hazards, and any kind of degree of entrapment. Get as calm and composed as possible to radio in an initial scene report and call for additional resources that you may need. Communications. So on arrival, give a brief report and request necessary resources. Have a face-to-face conversation with command staff, if possible. I see only one person to converse with Communication Center, and then they disseminate the information to others. Organization. So early and aggressive organization is vital. Communication is probably the biggest breakdown in mass casualty incidents that we have. Because there are, we learned that from Katrina in 2005. So after Katrina, we started seeing all of these requirements for our radios. So that way we could talk to different services with our radios. So our current radios have TAC channels for police, they have TAC channels for fire, they have TAC channels for EMS as well. Communication is probably the biggest breakdown. Have a plan to deploy resources, think big, order big, and if you don't need it, then you can always cancel it, but at least you got it coming. Think about supply and staging areas, prevent any kind of freelancing, and have some personal tools such as a tactical worksheet to kind of go off of. Scene management. So senior person should assume incident command, oversee the medical aspects and all safety of all personnel, designate area supervisors, work with fire and police commanders, and keep uninjured people from becoming injured, and then restrict any kind of access to the scene as well. Psychological aspects of mass casualty incidents. So there's this thing called psychological first aid, and it may be necessary for a long-term thing for your patients as well as your emergency responders. So we're not going to try and attempt to engage in psychoanalysis on these patients. We just want to use a caring, honest demeanor and reassure that patient. Emergency responders are subject to emotional distress, so a stress debriefing counselor should be available, and emotionally incapacitated EMTs should be treated as patients as well. So there's several different branches that can branch off from command. So you can have your EMS branch, which functions as extrication, staging area, triage, treatment, transport, and rehab. So triage. In a mass casualty incident, the goal is to afford the greatest number of people the greatest chance of survival. The most knowledgeable EMS provider becomes the triage supervisor. Okay. So for primary triage, we triage these patients either as priorities or colors. So priority 1s, 2s, 3s, and 4s. So we in start triage we label them as colors. So simple triage and rapid treatment. It's the foundation of system is speed and simplicity, consistency of application. And it provides just simple commands to the patient. It is based on an RPM mnemonic, so respiration, pulse, and mental status. You're going to go through and look at respirations on patients. You're going to look at their pulse and their mental status. And then you're going to, based on that, you're going to determine whether or not they're red, yellow, green, or black. Okay. So are they able to walk? If they are, they're walking wounded or green, and they're priority 3. If they're not, then we're going to check respirations. Okay. So we're only going to provide 3 treatments during start triage. We're going to open an airway and insert an OPA, apply pressure to any kind of bleeding, and elevate an extremity. Okay. So after we check mental status or the ability to walk, we're going to assess their respirations. So if they have breathing and they're breathing greater than 30 times a minute, they're priority 1 or red. If they are breathing and they're breathing less than 30 times a minute, then we're going to check for a pulse. Okay. If they're not breathing, we're going to position the airway and recheck respirations. And if they're still not breathing after we open the airway, then we're going to label them as black. Assess our radial pulse. So if they're unresponsive, they're not breathing, and they have no pulse, they are priority 4 or black. If they are breathing with no radial pulse, then they are a priority 1 or red. And if they are breathing, have a pulse, they have good skin signs and cap refill, then we're going to check mental status. Okay. Mental status, so if they are alert, they are now a priority 2 or a yellow. If they have altered mental status, then they're a priority 1 or a red. And then we're going to go back and re-triage the priority 3 walking wounded patients. So again, respiration, pulse, and mental status. We're going to color code those patients. So priority 1 is red, 2 is yellow, 3 is green, and 4 is black. SALT. This is another form of triage. It's sort, assess, life-saving interventions, and treatment and transport. So immediate red color coded patients are patients with severe injuries who are likely to survive with treatment. If they have a peripheral pulse, the patient is not in respiratory distress, hemorrhage controlled, does the patient follow commands or make purposeful movements? Any no answer is tagged as an immediate, and we're going to move those patients to a collection point. Yellow or delayed, these are serious injuries but not tagged as immediate. So we're going to ask the questions of, does the patient have a peripheral pulse? Are they not in respiratory distress? Is hemorrhage controlled? Does the patient follow commands or make purposeful movements? Yes to all of these with significant injury is tagged as delayed or yellow. Your minimal or color code green, these patients are going to be patients with minor injuries who can walk, talk, breathe, do all the things. Your black or dead patients, these are patients with injuries incompatible with life or without spontaneous respirations. You're going to ask the patient, or ask yourself, is the adult patient not breathing after the EMT opens the airway? Is the child not breathing after the EMT opens the airway and gives 2 breaths? If the answer is yes, then they are tagged and remain in place. Expectant, so with SALT, there's this color code gray of expectant, and these patients are unlikely to survive given the available resources, and they're only going to receive treatment after immediate patients have been moved forward. Secondary triage is performed at a patient collection point or triage area. Patients are separated into treatment groups based on their priority level. Each treatment area should have its own treatment supervisor, and it may be necessary to recategorize those patients whose condition has deteriorated or improved. So if you triage a patient red and they're really a yellow, are you wrong? No, because they're going to get retriaged and retriaged and retriaged. Okay. So once assessed, triaged, and treated, patients are transported according to priority, where they get triaged again after treatment. So the staging area is where ambulances wait for patients. There's a staging supervisor that keeps track of ambulance vehicles and personnel. The transportation supervisor arranges transport of the patients from the scene to the hospital. So when we overwhelm a hospital surge capacity, it could bring about poor outcomes. So the sooner we can let the hospital know that we have a mass casualty incident, the better, because they have a whole process to take care of mass casualty incidents. So they're going to call more staff in. They're going to set up tents outside the hospital. They may even send people to the scene to help us triage and treat. But most likely they're going to set up tents at the hospital, and they're just going to start triaging patients there as well. So communicating with hospitals, your facility should be contacted early to determine capabilities and update on expected patient counts. The transportation officer, not individual EMTs, should communicate, and generally too many patients are to allow for a good radio report, so only basic information is given. Sometimes in these situations, they will have somebody who just takes in ambulances, and you don't necessarily have to give them a radio report or anything like that. You just walk into the hospital or drive to the hospital, get out, and take your patient up there, and they will triage right there after a basic report. All right, so if you have any questions, let me know, and I will answer those to the best of my ability.